right, this is the Essential C.S. Lewis Week 3 of 7. So at this point, we've gotten a bit of distance into Mere Christianity, right? We finished book 1 last week. Did anyone get a chance to read book 1 over the past week? Or sections of it? I feel like you did.
I read part of it.
You read part of it. What about you?
I was reading before this class.
Yeah,
I was reading here and there, but not in a structured way. But I'll try to finish.
Yeah. No, it's
It's
just
not fast reading. It's kind of like you really have to think about it as you go.
definitely. I think based on something he says in the second book that we'll start, that he was trying to keep each chapter to 10 minutes of audio time. So I found that reading them out loud, each chapter takes me about 10 minutes. And I thought I was just a consistent reader, but I think Lewis was doing that on purpose. Did you also, did you mention that you were
Not recently, no.
Not recently. Okay, great. Yeah, part of the reason that I ask is I'm curious about how this structure works, what we talked about first, and then you might go read it. So feel free to come talk to me afterwards if you read it and get any insights or anything.
I've watched the videos. I'd send you the link. Serious video.
Yeah, those are great. Those audiobooks are really great. Okay, we'll start with a quick word of prayer. Dear Lord, just thank you for this day. Thank you once more for this opportunity to come to church, to fellowship with other believers, and to worship you together. Just pray for your blessings on this next hour as we look a little bit into Lewis's Mere Christianity. I just pray that you would make it come alive. I pray that you would speak despite of the human weakness of all the intermediaries that you like to use. I just pray that your truth would come out and shine through and make us become more like you and help us to worship you more closely. I just thank you once more for this time and this close to your name. Okay, quick review, but as I said, we don't have a lot of time this time. We're in week 3. Ideally, if we can finish book 2 today and get into book 3, we can finish book 3 and 4 next week, and then the last 3 weeks of the class, we can get into Screwtape letters. Personally, I like Lewis's fiction more than his nonfiction, so I'm gunning to get into Screwtape letters, but that's kind of the plan. Okay, Lewis, 1898 to 1963. We established last week that he got saved in 1931, so he would have been 33 years old. And he's writing Mere Christianity in the middle of World War II, so 10 years afterwards. He's at Oxford, he's giving these radio talks. In a sense, it's only 10 years after he's become a Christian, but I still consider this one of Lewis's sort of middle period mature works. Okay, I had this chart out earlier, I'll just put it again. Lewis's major works. I added The Everlasting Man by Chesterton because we mentioned it last week as an influence. It might come up again today if we have time. And I also mentioned Abolition of Man because we mentioned that. So as we go through this class, I'll try to add more books that come in so that this chart kind of is just a useful resource. But we have the nonfiction on this side, the fiction on this side. We're starting with Mere Christianity and Screwtape letters, but I think that you can sort of radiate outwards depending on your interest. Okay, Mere Christianity, a series of radio talks given during World War II, 1942, 43, 44. And we did book 1, right? There's 4 books in the book, but book 1 is Right and Wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Now we had mentioned that Lewis's goal with the entire set, the entire book, is to convey to the nation of England during a time of war what Christians believe. And yet, book 1, he hasn't done that yet. He hasn't really talked about the Bible. He hasn't really talked about God. So I'm going to quickly go through the argument of book 1, and then we'll get into book 2. Chapter 1 is the law of human nature, right? And this is the concluding sentence of that chapter. These then are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings over all the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and you cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. So this is kind of going to ground Lewis's argument. We all have this law of morality, and this is what all of our interactions with each other is based on. Then we get to this idea that the law of human nature must be something that is really there, not made up by ourselves. In this particular case, there's something above and beyond the ordinary facts of human behavior, and yet quite definitely real. A real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. In contrast to laws of nature that correspond to rocks and trees and birds and fish, those laws of nature describe how those parts of nature moral law of nature doesn't describe how we act, it tells us how we should act. So this is a kind of different level of reality, and yet Lewis is saying it has to be real. All of our interactions with each other, particularly quarreling, but really any social interaction, is founded on this idea that we share a moral standard in common. And that was really chapter 1. But chapter 3, he's going to indicate that this is here, it's sort of been placed upon us, and if it's been placed upon us from outside, we can't reverse engineer it through evolutionary means or kind of social utilitarianism. Someone must have put it upon us, which means there must have been a someone that put it upon us. In chapter 5, we start to think, okay, just based on what we've established, what can we find out about this someone, about God? We have two bits of evidence about God. The universe, the fact that he created the universe, tells us that he was a great artist, for the universe is a very beautiful place, but also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. Second bit of evidence, the moral law. This is that sense that we all have. That tells us that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. What we don't have is softness. We don't have grace. We don't have forgiveness, right? The moral law, our own consciences, are very harsh. They don't let us off the hook. So Lewis is saying, if we're trying to get as far as we can by reason alone, how far have we gotten? We've gotten far enough to be uneasy. We know that God exists. We know that he's holy, and we know that we're not. And that's kind of it. Not a very, encouraging picture. But this is a reason that he starts this project in this way. And he tells us that. Why did I start in this way? Why didn't I just start with John 3:16 or Genesis 1? Here's why. Christianity simply does not make sense until you have faced the sort of facts I've been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of, and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. And I said that last week, that this is the Romans 3:23 idea. Once you're on board with that, we can get into the gospel, but not before. There's kind of no point if you're not there yet. So that's why Lewis structures his argument that way. That's why 1 out of the 4 books in Mere Christianity has not said the word Christianity yet, because he wants to prepare you and the audience for Christianity. Now, before we move into book 2, I just want to say a thing about book 1 as a whole. There's a literary device that Lewis uses pretty often. Once at the end of chapter 1, at the beginning and end of chapter 3, at the beginning and end of chapter 4, and at the beginning and end of chapter 5. This literary device is a recap, right? Probably not what you're expecting, but just that simple idea of, hey, let's take everything that we've established so far and just summarize it and give you a review. This is an excellent resource. As a teacher, parents, you probably know you have to repeat the same thing multiple times in order for your children, for your students, for your audience to really understand what you're getting at. And Lewis does this really often. As you can see, as the book continues, he does it more and more because the argument is getting more and more complex. So, as a writer, as a teacher, that's an excellent skill. You want repetition. But as a reader, especially someone who doesn't enjoy, philosophical, theological texts, I'm talking about myself here, these recaps are they're like oases in the desert. I'm like, okay, I can take a break and just check in with the author. Are we on the same page? Have I lost the plot a little bit? And I'll tell you that if I'm reading a book and I'm halfway through the chapter, I'm not really sure what's going on. If I know that the author is a good one, sometimes I'll just hold out and kind of keep reading and hope for one of these recaps. And if I find one, it gives me a chance. Did I know what he was going to say? If he's telling me something that I should already know, did I already know it? Or am I hearing it for the first time, in which case I should probably go back and read the chapter again. So these recaps are really helpful. And as a reader, if you look out for them, authors indicate them to you. They often say things like, and what I've been saying up till now is this, or the main point of this is this. Your ears should perk up when you see something like that, because it'll just help you kind of cement the content when you read. And there's kind of the converse of this also, which is a preview. So an author might tell you, my 2 points in this chapter are boom, 1 and 2. So if you look out for those things, you can kind of start building like a bullet point summary in your head. And once you finish reading and someone asks you, so what did you read yesterday? You don't have to be like, oh man, I know I definitely read something. You can kind of have this structure. Okay, I remember he did this, and then this, and then this. And Lewis is great at these recaps. Some of them are so powerful that if you zoned out the entire chapter, but you just read the recap sentence, you're probably okay to continue. So keep an eye out for these. As we get into book 2, I actually want you to forget everything that I just said, because the structure of book 2 is very different, right? Book 1 is Lewis's introduction into the argument. So he's still talking to people that are most likely mixed. He hasn't got into what Christianity is, and he wants to lead his audience to be ready for Christianity. Book 2 is different. Now he is going to get into Christian doctrine. So I made just a brief outline of book 1 versus book 2, right? We've already done book 1, so that should be familiar, but I'm giving you the outline of book 2 because they're both 5 chapters. Book 1, we have the law of human nature in chapter 1. We have some objections in chapter 2. We have the idea that the human nature law is prescriptive in chapter 3. We have the idea that the fact that it's prescriptive means someone else must have placed it upon us. And chapter 5 is, what do we know about this someone? What do we know about God if we don't pay attention to Christianity? We just go off of reason. That's a scary picture of God. So now if you're good and scared, you're ready for Christianity, right? That's how book 1 is, and I would say it's pretty linear, it's pretty clear. And like I said, he signals the moves that he's going to make to you. He doesn't do that in book 2, right? Book 2, I think that this is a little bit of a mess. And when I was reading it, I was like, man, I'm not getting it. I'm not understanding, his structure, his sequence. It's not a matter of competence, right? Clearly he has the ability to be communicative about his structure if he wants. He did that in book 1. But I realized that book 2 is Christian doctrine. In book 2, he covers, the basics of Christian doctrine. He covers God created the world, the fall of man, the role of Satan and the angels, Christ, atonement, salvation, sanctification, resurrection, life in heaven. These all things are here. And I think that he knows that his audience, whether they're Christian or not, probably fancy themselves comfortable, familiar with the doctrines of Christianity, right? Christianity, at the time that Lewis is writing, it's starting to fall out of favor. It's starting to not be seen as intellectual, and in many cases it might already be the case. So if Lewis wants to communicate something simple, like Genesis 1:1 or John 3:16, I think what he figures is that the wrong way to do it is just the most obvious, straightforward, kind of like Sunday school way to do it. There's a quote that I want to read to you that's in book 2. It's chapter 2 of book 2. And it sort of highlights this quality that Lewis loved, that I'm going to call surprisingness. Not that something is surprising because it's spoiled for you, but the idea that something is always surprising and that you wouldn't have come up with something like this. So this is the quote. Reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons I, Lewis, believe Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. This is the kind of thing that gets lost on us as we become more and more familiar with anything, right? I mean, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Genesis 1, where after God creates the sun and the moon, he says, I created the sun and the moon to rule over the day and the night. We already had 2 days and nights. I mean, no scientist could come up with the idea that day pre-exists sun and that sun was created after and kind of given this like, oh, why don't you do this job? Maybe you'll be good at it. That's the kind of thing that you can't make up. That's the kind of thing that excites me about Christianity. Because if we believe it's the Word of God, it's more than just something that smart people figured out. It should have elements in it that are kind of unguessable, kind of unfigure-outable by humans. And that's what Lewis loves about Christianity. But he also knows that his audience, they're educated, they're English, so they kind of have the sense that, like, yeah, we're a Christian country, even if I'm not personally Christian. That's kind of the attitude. And so what he wants to do is convey these very core Christian doctrines, I think in a way that highlights their surprisingness, so that people don't just feel like, yeah, I went to Sunday school when I was a kid, I know all this stuff already. He kind of wants to keep us guessing. So if you're reading this chapter, you might feel a little bit more at sea, because it's not as clear and as linear as the first book. But I think that's good, because people think of Lewis as this sort of like Aristotelian logician, where like this implies this implies this. I don't believe that that's Lewis, but that's not also real life. And I think book 2 is much more artistic in the way that his turns and his kind of navigation is much more surprising. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, I'm going quick, so if you do have questions, please feel to interrupt me at any time. Okay, chapter 1 of book 2 is called The Rival Conceptions of God. The first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. So, kind of simple chart here. We have all of humanity, all of their religious beliefs, and he's going to separate that into atheism and theism. Okay, second division. If you're a theist, we're not talking about the atheist for now, but within the theism category, what is the nature of God? And he'll say that there's two groups. One group thinks that he is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another bad, but according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. Now, this might sound a little strange, but I think that this is one of the dominant views of metaphysics, about ethics, especially now. This phrase that he uses, beyond good and evil, if that sounds familiar to anyone, there's a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, and he wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil. And I think that far and away, if you want to understand our modern age, certainly our postmodern age, Nietzsche is pretty dominant. So I think Lewis is kind of doing a nod to this idea that intellectuals kind of believe, yeah, once you get really elevated, good and evil, yeah, those are cute, but we're doing something different. Yes, Mike?
Well, that's really Gnosticism, but it's also Hinduism.
It is.
Hinduism, when you get back in Hinduism, there's no real distinction. It just is.
Yeah, and the people that he names that he thinks are this is, he actually calls this group pantheism. He says that this often goes with the idea that God animates the universe like I animate my body. And he says, I think Hegel, we were talking about Hegel earlier, he says, I think Hegel believes this.
Yeah.
I think as far as I can see, Hinduism believes this. I think he would put Nietzsche in that category. The other category is, Jews, Christians, and Muslims that believe that God is opinionated. God is good, he's not bad, and there's kind of no confusion about that. So those are kind of the two groups. So I split them out. Within theism, we have this pantheistic, God is beyond evil kind of idea, and then we have the Abrahamic religions. It basically says God is good, he's opposed to evil. Now, he is going to have both atheism and pantheism in his crosshairs before moving on to the next chapter. So we'll see how he does that. And he's going to start by addressing pantheism. If you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like a pantheist. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. In contrast, Christians think that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists very loudly, on our putting them right again. Now, what he's getting at is sometimes known as theodicy, sometimes known as the problem of pain, but it's just the idea that when we look at the world, it doesn't seem that great, right? There's this cruelty and injustice and, people preying upon each other, but even natural disasters and disease. How do you explain all that stuff? How do you account for it? he's not going to say that pantheism has an answer and the answer is wrong. He's going to say pantheism can't even engage with that question because, again, they're going to say that the divine view of the universe, which is the right one, doesn't see a difference between bad and good like we do because we're down here. So a pantheist can kind of grant the appearance of evil, the illusion of evil, but they can't acknowledge the existence, the reality of evil. And this is kind of all the time he spends on pantheism, and we might be expecting a more thorough takedown. But if you remember some of the things we've been talking about in book 1, that Lewis is always going to be grounding his arguments in universal human experience. So all he's going to say is, does that hold water? Can someone convince you that injustice doesn't exist? Like, is anyone going to buy that argument? That if you see something evil, it's not. There's nothing evil, you're just looking at it from the wrong perspective. Now, I think that Lewis doesn't spend a lot of time on his argument because it's not a full sort of takedown of pantheism. That's actually where he ends this discussion of it. But I want to put this to us because I think that pantheism in its different manifestations, in kind of a postmodern moral relativism, is very dominant. And obviously, like religions that kind of directly practice pantheism, maybe we don't see them as much, but they're also out there. And this is kind of Lewis's takedown. He's going to move on. But I kind of want to gauge the room for a second. Does that argument make sense? I'm granting that it could be more fleshed out. He could spend more time on it, and he doesn't. But does that satisfy, us as readers? Do we feel like he should have spent more time on it? Does that question make sense?
It just seems like if you're a consistent Hindu and you see somebody suffering on the road or whatever, you don't help them because you're going to mess up their karma.
Hmm.
So there is that element too where you're trying to be consistent as a pantheist.
Yeah, I can't say I know it very well. I mean, my dad started out and became a Christian. And Lewis himself will say that he's not a scholar. But the funny thing is, when Lewis, we talked about his conversion story, that it was this step-by-step process. The last two religions he was considering was Christianity and Hinduism. So I have reason to believe that he thought about it sincerely and he thought about it deeply. And it's funny because I think that he's not even saying that these people don't act morally, right? We'll get into atheism later. He doesn't say that there's no atheist that has ever acted morally. He's just saying, as a worldview, it doesn't make sense. You can't explain it all the way down.
And that's the rationalist apologetic. It really is, because we're going to compare our different reasons and pick the one that makes sense to you.
we can talk about it later. I don't see it that way, but I know he's read that way. I'm going to move on because there's more to get into, but it's something to think about. It's not just Hinduism that Lewis is attacking here. It's really what I would call like postmodernism, like the idea that morality is relative. So these ideas, I think, are very common nowadays. That's partially why I want you guys to, when you read this, don't feel like you have to say, oh, okay, sweet. Like, he did it, I can move on, I don't have to think about it. Because you'll talk to people that say stuff like this. And part of the point of this book is to equip you, to help you to know what to say. And it's helpful if you sort of feel, yeah, like this is a convincing argument to me, I can go tell it to someone else. But he's going to move on from this beyond good and evil stuff. And he's going to just talk about the world. Okay, if we have sort of agreed that there is, injustice in the world, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? When I was an atheist, when Lewis was an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, right? And now he's just straight up telling you, the problem of pain, theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? Let's just deal with it. Now, I will say that Lewis thought this was the strongest argument for atheism, and that was sort of the one that caught him, and the last argument that he sort of had to, defeat for himself. I will also say that just from my own experience, talking to people that are atheists and hearing kind of vaunted celebrities that are atheists, whether they're scientists or stand-up comics, this seems to be the argument that they go to. And how could you say God created? What about cancer and like sickle cell anemia? And it just doesn't So I think that this is a very common argument. I don't happen to think that it's a very strong one, and Lewis will sort of take care of it. But part of the reason I'm spending more time on this chapter is because this is more practical, right? Like, I think atheism is not as big as it was maybe a couple decades ago, but I think you still meet people that say stuff like this, and this is often their reason. And I know growing up in the church that when I was a kid, I didn't have an answer. Like, I don't think growing up in the church, I knew that Christians had thought about this. So when my kind of snooty, middle school friends were like, you believe in God? Like, what about cancer? I was like, oh yeah, I never thought about that. And yet, it's one of the oldest questions that theologians have been considering for thousands of years. So some of that is just ignorance on our part. We don't have to feel discomforted by some of these attacks because they're very obvious, and so that's kind of why Lewis is not going to spend too much time on this. But I will kind of plug his other book, Problem of Pain. I think if you like reading Lewis's nonfiction, this is a good step up. This is actually a little bit easier. Well, yeah, I would say it's a little bit easier than Abolition of Man. It's a little longer. I did it in a book club, and there were passages where I had to just take bullet points so I could keep track of what he's saying. But this is a very rigorous treatment of the problem of pain. And Lewis talks about, person to person. Why does God allow that? Why does God allow natural disasters? Why does he allow animals to feel pain? Like, he's dealing with this problem from every angle, and he's marshaling a lot of great historical arguments. I would still say pretty intelligible, but certainly a little bit more philosophical. One thing about it is Lewis does say in the preface is that if someone's hurting in pain right now, that's not what this book is for. It's not a devotional. It's like a rigorous kind of, a little bit of an intellectual, philosophical, theological exercise. But it's helpful. And I think it's another thing that, I did it with a book club with some of the kids in the college group at the church that I was at, and a lot of these arguments are very old and just very unknown. So it's a helpful resource, and I'll just plug that. But this problem of pain question is going to continue being useful to Lewis. We kind of knocked out pantheism, and we'll move on to atheism. But how had I, this is Lewis when he was an atheist, how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as, if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creature with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. These atheists, right, they're saying, God, you're unjust by my standard of justice. And Lewis is asking, well, where did you get a standard of justice from? He's already kind of dispensed with arguments that it can be evolutionarily developed because of social utilitarianism or whatnot. He already talked about that in book 1, that the moral law, you can't justify it on outside terms. We do it because it's been placed upon us. And so an atheist is kind of stuck. He doesn't have a standard by which to call God unjust. This final metaphor about no light in the universe, no creature with eyes, we should never know it was dark. The atheist that is sort of quaking in fury at the injustice of God is a little bit like saying, we're in this universe where there's no light and no one has any eyes, but I'm afraid of the dark. The fact that it's dark is causing me existential dread. There's something wrong with that statement. It just doesn't make any sense. This is another argument that I think is very fundamental, and it can seem like he's almost playing a word game, but I just think that Lewis is not going to spend too much time on atheism. He kind of finds it shallow, and he's going to kind kind of continually call it shallow, and yet it has this hold, to some extent, on our culture. This is another thing, that I think this is a very powerful argument, and I haven't actually seen, this book came out in the 40s, so people have had plenty of time to respond to it. I haven't really found what I would call a solid, rationally, valid argument against this line of questioning. I really do think it's where atheism breaks down. But, like I said, it can go quick. I mean, this is all in chapter 1, and we talked about it a little while ago. Each chapter only takes 10 minutes to read. But if you think about all the people that are beyond good and evil and all the people that are atheists, what percentage of the world is that? So these are things that it's good to take time and slow down and just kind of feel like, am I convinced by this argument? Or can I sort of empathize with an atheist for a second and try to figure out, how would I try to respond to this? Are we tracking generally so far? Do I have to go ahead to keep going? Okay, sorry.
You can't get there from here, is what you're saying.
What's that?
You can't get there from here.
Yes, right. I do think that he's... Okay, so this is our chart. He's kind of knocked out the beyond good and evil. He's kind of knocked out atheism. So we're traveling down this slide to Christianity. We'll get there, I promise. But this question still remains, right? This question of theodicy, we haven't answered it. We've said, okay, pantheism can't even enter the conversation. Atheism, not an answer, but we still have to answer it. And that's where chapter 2 comes in. He's going to say that only 2 forms of thinking can actually even start to answer this question. One of them is Christianity, and one of them is dualism, which is the idea that there are 2 equally power but morally opposite deities at work in the universe. He's going to refute that, and that's going to be chapter 2, so I'll let you enjoy that for yourself. But once he refutes dualism, he's going to give you the classic Christian answer, which has something to do with sin and something to do with the devil. So I'll read that section. One of the things that surprised me when I first read the New Testament seriously was that it talked so much about a dark power in the universe, a mighty evil spirit who is held to be the power behind death and disease and sin. The difference between Christianity and dualism. The difference is that Christianity thinks this dark power was created by God and was good when he was created and went wrong. Christianity agrees with dualism that this universe is at war, but it does not think this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it is a civil war, a rebellion, and that we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. One thing that hit me when I read this passage is, they're in a war right now. It's called World War II. So these kind of spiritual warfare figures of speech are true, but they must have hit his readers, his listeners, in a strong way. And it's not just a metaphor, right? It truly is. It truly is a war that we're in, a spiritual war. But this is kind of the Christian answer to why is there evil in the universe. There's one part of it anyway, right? That there was this Satan, he was corrupted, and he sinned. So in chapter 3, Lewis talks about, okay, what is the sin that Satan did? The moment you have a self at all, there is a possibility of putting yourself first, wanting to be the center, wanting to be God, in fact. That was the sin of Satan. And that was the sin he taught the human race. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery. The long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. He has this image of a human machine that runs on a certain kind of fuel. And the fuel that we run on is God, something like gasoline. And all we're trying to do is pour whatever liquid we can find into this engine that's not God. So we're putting apple juice down there, bleach, olive oil. Nothing is working, and we're surprised every single time. But that's what sin is, and that's what Satan did, right? And now he'll move into that's what we did. That's what the fall is. Then comes the real shock. Sorry, I missed a slide. What is God's response to this? Right? This is Satan being the active protagonist. He falls, he sins. Here we are. How does God respond? Lewis will say that God did 3 things. 1, he gave us that moral law, right? Everything we talked about in book 1. was to give us a sense that something is wrong. The second thing he talks about is the myths, right? And Lewis calls these good dreams. I mentioned last week, and I'll mention it again, he's getting that straight from this book, The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. The idea that some of the pagan religions, though they were wrong, have some sort of preparation function to prepare people to receive Christ. So that's the second thing that God did. And third is what we're all probably thinking. He directly revealed himself to the Israelites. Then comes a real shock. Among these Jews, there suddenly turns up a man who goes about talking as if he was God. He claims to forgive sins. He says he has always existed. He says he is coming to judge the world at the end of time. What this man said was, quite simply, the most shocking thing that has ever been uttered by human lips. This is why I started with surprising this, right? This is actually the first even reference to Jesus in the book, I believe. And there's just so many ways. I mean, Jesus is the classic Sunday school answer, right? I remember by the time I finished elementary school, I thought it was just like the stupidest answer to the stupidest question. I didn't think, if Jesus is the answer to a question, maybe it's a very important question, and it's one that I'll kind of struggle with my whole life. But Lewis goes about introducing Jesus in this kind of roundabout way. You know, why is he talking about myths? Why is he talking about morality? And then Jesus kind of pops up on the scene. And Lewis wants us to pay very close attention to the kinds of things that he says, right? And he'll give an example. One part of the claim that Jesus makes tends to slip past us unnoticed because we have heard it so often that we no longer see what it amounts to. I mean the claim to forgive sins, any sins. Now, unless the speaker is God, this is really so preposterous as to be comic. And he'll go on to say that if you step on my toe, I am within my rights to forgive you. But if you step on my brother's toe, and his fourth grade, PE teacher forgives you, it's ridiculous. You have nothing to do with the situation, right? Why are you going around forgiving other people's sins? The way that Jesus is responding is as if he is the offended party, the primary offended party in every sin. Now, scholars attack Lewis after the Mere Christianity because they say, maybe Jesus was misunderstood by his disciples. He never directly claimed to be God, so maybe they took some of his words and twisted him, and he wasn't really a bad guy. They just kind of exaggerated his story. I think that's complete nonsense. And I think Lewis thinks that that's complete nonsense. And you see this by the way that people treat Jesus in the Gospels, right? The Pharisees are no friends of his, but they are quite sure that they heard what they heard. They're quite sure they heard someone say, I'm God. They didn't come right out and say it, but he said it, and they got the picture. And I think Lewis just doesn't want us to get so used to what Jesus does and what he says that we just think, oh yeah, Jesus forgives sins. Like, that's great, and that's awesome. He's going to say that this is one of those things, like the Son, being delegated responsibility over the day. That's one of those things you couldn't have seen coming. So you don't see anything like this. You don't see someone forgiving you for a sin that you did to someone else. Certainly no one that feels, the authority to do that for all sins. Now this is where Lewis gets into what's probably the most famous individual concept from the entire book, which is sometimes called Lewis's trilemma, right? If we take Jesus at his word, what conclusions are we left with? So I'm going to read this section. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. And this is kind of the trilemma, right? Meaning you have three options. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. These are your only three options. But let us not come away with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. The reason that I say that this is probably the single most kind of influential nugget is if you're looking for Lewis's Mere Christianity's impact on apologetics as a whole, it's this trilemma. I still think it's a pretty solid argument. I've looked at some of the arguments that critics and biblical scholars have tried to lobby against it. I haven't really found anything worth mentioning. But it's something that, again, you will find people just don't think about this. I know most biblical scholars are of this kind of humanistic idea that Jesus never really claimed to be God. Most biblical scholars, right? But if you ask them this question, I haven't found anyone give a solid answer that allows you to get out of it. Now Lewis starts the next chapter, chapter 4, by saying, I don't see him as a lunatic or a demon. So the only option that I am left with is that he is the Son of God. Let's go with that, right? Now, if he's the Son of God, we're getting into chapter 4 now, what did he come to do? Well, you might say, to teach, of course, right? That's what people normally come to do, to teach. They're prophets. But as soon as you look into the New Testament or any other Christian writing, you will find they are constantly talking about something different, about his death and his coming to life again. It's obvious that Christians think the chief point of the story lies there. They think the main thing he came to earth to do was to suffer and be killed. This is, a little bit he's attacking the people that say Jesus was this great human teacher and philosopher and all this sort of stuff. He's saying if you look at the Bible, if you look at Christianity, the essence is really that Jesus came and died and was raised again. And he's straight up, the central Christian belief is that Christ's death has somehow put us right with God and given us a fresh start. For the rest of this chapter, he talks about this concept of atonement, and that there are sort of different theories of how exactly atonement works. But it's not that you have to fully understand exactly how atonement works or accept one of the myriad theories of atonement to become a Christian. All you have to do is believe this. You have to agree with everything we said in book 1. There's a God, he created the universe, he has his moral standard, he told us about it, we failed. But the Christian message, the unique thing that separates Christianity from all of the other religions out there, is this, that God himself died for us and was resurrected, and somehow that changes our relationship with Christ. That's what chapter 4 is about. Chapter 5 is called the practical conclusion. Okay, so how do we receive this life, right? Now the Christian belief is that if we somehow share the humility and suffering of Christ, we shall also share in his conquest of death and find a new life after we have died, and in it become perfect and perfectly happy creatures. This means something much more than our trying to follow his teaching. People often ask when the next step in evolution, the step to something beyond man, will happen. Sounds like another Nietzschean idea, but on the Christian view, it has happened already. In Christ, a new kind of man appeared. And the new kind of life, which began in him, is to be put into us. Now, Lewis will say, and remember, his goal is mere Christianity, right? So he's not trying to pick a lane in terms of denominations or anything like that. He's going to say that if you look at the Bible, pretty much Christians will agree that you need baptism, belief, and the Lord's Supper to receive this new life. And he says that, well, some denominations emphasize some more and some less, and I've had letters written to me about you should really only have belief and not the other two, but everyone has some element of these things because they're in the Bible. And he kind of talks about how it works to live this new life, how to receive it. And I don't have a quote for it, but he does kind of draw this parallel to how we received physical human life from our parents. But that's kind of a process that it doesn't really necessitate the outcome that it has. It's hard to explain why the physical process of human generation leads to new life. And so he's going to say that the same is true about the spiritual process of receiving a new life. It doesn't fully make sense to us, and yet here it is. So we take it on faith, but it has that element of surprisingness that he loves so much. Now, what about trying to be good, right? He says that we don't gain this new life by trying to be good. So I'll read here. The Christian is in a different position from other people who are trying to be good. They hope, the other people, they hope by being good to please God, if there is one. Or, if they think there is not, at least they hope to deserve approval from good men, right? And this is what we were talking about earlier. Can pantheists be moral? Can atheists be moral? Sure. But it's going to come down to one of these two reasons. But the Christian thinks any good he does comes from the Christ life inside him. He does not think God will love us because we are good, but God will make us good because he loves us, just as the roof of a greenhouse does not attract the sun because it is bright, but becomes bright because the sun shines on it. Right? I mean, this is a fundamental kind of difference between moral behavior as a Christian and moral behavior as anything else. We're not doing it to earn favor with God, right? It's the opposite way around. And yet, I mean, having been a Christian my whole life, I know that I still fall into that worldly idea that I need to win God's favor. I haven't done enough to win his favor. That's not how Christian life works, right? We believe that Christ has this life that now lives in us that allows us to do good works. It's a completely upside down, it's a different model. Okay, now you can see that we've covered the basics of Christian doctrine, as I said before. We've done it in this weird way, and Lewis has gone out of his way to say, isn't that strange? Isn't that surprising? You wouldn't have been able to come up with that. Well, we've covered all the bases, and now we've gotten into what we sometimes call a sanctification, right? What should you as a Christian actually do? And that's why book 3 is called Christian Behavior. Now we'll get into morality. And you have to think again about Lewis's audience here, right? This is the 40s. So we haven't had all of the crazy revolution stuff of the 60s, but we're building, we're getting there. People are out there making those arguments, pushing this along. And so he doesn't really want to give this vision of morality that people will associate with, repression, control. He has an anecdote about a child was asked what he thought God was, and the child said, God is someone who tries to find out if anyone is having a good time and putting a stop to it. So he doesn't think that that's actually what morality is, and he doesn't want to present it that way either. If you remember the earlier model of a machine running on the proper fuel, he is going to say that morality is similar to that, right? We believe that a lot of our sinful desires come from a willingness to replace God with something else, something unfulfilling. And he's going to say morality is similar in that it just makes the human machine run right. The first chapter is called The 3 Parts of Morality. There are 2 ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from each other, or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. And this is 2 of the 3 parts, right? The first one is what we were talking about in book 1. That's what, when Lewis says everyone agrees in Abolition of Man, everyone agrees on morality, that's the part he's talking about. You don't mess with me, I won't mess with you, we'll live in a town together, things will be great. That's only one part of morality. So even though in the Abolition of Man argument, it sounds like Lewis is saying there's nothing special about Christian morality, he's saying, well, there's one part, which is kind of the most external, obvious part, that we all agree on, but there's 2 other parts that really only Christians are dealing with. The second part is internal, right? So it's not about utilitarianism. It's not about, if I do this action, does it affect someone else? Does it harm someone else? He's talking about the idea that we believe vices actually harm you. They harm your soul, even if they don't physically harm you. That's the second thing. And then he gives us this wonderful metaphor that I really want to spend some time on. You get the idea of plane, if you think of us, that is humanity, as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these 2 things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid a collision. That's the first 2 arguments, the first 2 parts of morality. There's a third part. There's one thing we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to. However well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrive at Calcutta. Morality, then, seems to be concerned with 3 things. First, with fair play and harmony between individuals. That's book 1, that's the law of human nature. Second, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside the individuals. This is, how are the different elements of you? Are they in balance with each other? And the third, the general purpose of human life as a whole. What man was made for. What course the whole fleet ought to be on. Which is why I love this metaphor of a fleet, right? Another way of thinking about it is that morality has 3 parts. One is, how do I relate with the other men in the world? The The second is, how do I relate with myself, with my own soul, with my own spirit? And the third is, how do I relate with God? You know, if we're a ship and we're a fleet of ships and we're all in perfect order and we're, you know, in harmony and we're all healthy, but we're sailing off the end of, you know, the world, that's not morality, actually. That's just effectively doing the exact wrong thing. Now, Lewis is going to say that normally when we talk about political discussions, when we talk about other people, we stay on that first level because it's easy, because we all basically agree. But he says that with Christianity, you start getting into disagreements with the second part, and you really start getting into disagreements about the third part. I'm going to go through chapters 2, 3, and 4 really fast. Chapter 2 is Lewis talking about what would a Christian social morality looks like. It's interesting. What he doesn't say is this is the kind of government that the Bible proposes. He merely says that, you know, politics is dependent on time and culture, and so the Bible doesn't do that. But if you were going to draw political principles from the Bible, he says the New Testament might give us more than we actually want. And I will say that reading his list of policy proposals, yeah, I wasn't buying it. I didn't like it. And what he's going to say is that's actually true of everyone. No one likes all of the policy proposals in the Bible because all of us ultimately are going to be, you know, mistaking the point. We don't really want a Christian society. You know, we can't comprehend what it would look like. And it actually requires everyone to be a Christian. So if you look at the early church, for example, that's different than something like a democracy because everyone in the church is Christian. If you're running a government, you can't know that. You can't force that. So it's sort of a chapter that's interesting, and I think he does a lot of good observations, saying, oh, you know, this is economic policy. This is how, you know, investments might work. This is how housing might work. And you'll just find that it doesn't map onto any political system in existence because, yeah, again, it's surprising. That's kind of what you'd expect. And it's not really a political system, right? He will end that chapter saying there's almost no point in trying to get to a Christian social policy. None of it matters unless you individually are, you know, behaving morally. And none of the society stuff matters if everyone in the society isn't a Christian with the right relationship with God, operating morality. So it's kind of like that fleet metaphor. He's saying that, you know, we're all worried about where the fleet is going, but if we can't even stop bumping into each other, it kind of doesn't matter. We have to focus on fundamentals. So chapter 3 well, how else would I have to say it? It's a little bit of a difference, right? He's going to say that after letting go of this social morality idea, did I skip a chapter? Sorry, just a minute. I did. Sorry about that. There's a chapter that wasn't in the broadcast talks, and he added it in the written section, and that's chapter 2. My apologies. So in chapter 1, he gives a way of looking at morality, right? There's these 3 parts, and we talked about them. In chapter 2, he gives a historical point that most Christians, if you look at the literature from the beginning of the church up until about the Renaissance, they would have conceived of morality in what's called the 7 virtues. And there are 4 cardinal virtues, which, you know, they basically said pagans were able to get this far. And then there's 3 Christian virtues, which are faith, hope, and love. So just Christians kind of get access to that one. And it's a good explanation of that system, of that way of looking at things. And if you want to read Christian literature, and like anything that's not modern, it's really helpful because that's the moral, ethical framework that they're going off of. It'll help you appreciate like Renaissance art. I don't know if that's something that you want, but these things are just so foundational to Christian literature and art that it's a helpful chapter. But he didn't put it in the radio broadcast because he just felt like he didn't have time. So he stuck to chapter 1. Chapter 3 was that social morality chapter that I was telling you about. And chapter 4 is called Morality and Psychoanalysis. Super interesting, and it's probably the last thing that we'll get to. Morality and psychoanalysis, right? Lewis is writing at a time when Freud's theories are pretty big, right? Jung is out there doing stuff. It's not gotten to the level where psychology is kind of the air that we breathe at this point. But he's sort of saying that if I'm telling you as a Christian that Christianity has a vision for how to fix the human machine, and psychoanalysis also claims to do the same thing, we should try to figure out how those 2 things engage with each other. What he's not going to say is that psychoanalysis is completely wrong. which is maybe what I was expecting. But he's also not going to say they're perfectly aligned. What he's going to say is that if you look at the philosophy of someone like Freud, that philosophy is not a Christian philosophy. That's a materialist philosophy. But if you look at psychoanalysis as a method, he believes there's a place for it. And what he was going to say is that it would be wrong to think that something that is a spiritual, moral problem requires a psychoanalytical method, and it would be wrong to say something that's a psychoanalytical method, something like irrational fear, cats. That's not a spiritual, moral problem. I found that chapter really interesting, and I know that nowadays we're sort of questioning, like, what exactly is counseling and how does it fit in with the church? So I found that chapter really interesting, and I think that because he's read, Freud, and he's closer to the time of the advent of psychoanalysis, I think he has a very clear, cogent read on it. That's pretty, moderate. So I think that's all I have. Yeah, we finished 4 chapters of chapter 3, partly because these 4 chapters are more general. Starting from the next few chapters of book 3, they get specific. He kind of goes chapter by chapter on a different virtue. When we get into chapter 4, we're not really talking about Christian behavior anymore. We're kind of talking about how Christians live in the world. So if anyone is keeping up with the reading, we covered all of book 2 and the first 4 chapters of book 3. So next week, we'll try to get through all of book 3 and all of book 4 to finish the book. I think that's everything. I actually finished on time. Thank you for not asking any questions. I know. I'll pray and formally dismiss, but if you want to stick around, ask questions, or just say something, I think we have the room until 9:50. So I'll just pray and dismiss. Dear Lord, thank you once again for this opportunity to look at this writer trying to show us your truths, your fundamental truths, maybe a different way than we're used to. So I just pray once more that your Spirit would speak to us clearly in the ways that you do, through the Bible, through the local church, through your Spirit, through counsel, elders, and also in literature like this. We just thank you for the ways that you care for us and you try to grab our attention with different things. Just pray once more for your blessings on the rest of our day today, and I ask all this. Amen.